Hello, welcome. My name is Dan Smith. I'm director of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. And with me, or well, not quite with me because he's in Geneva, is Filippo Grandi, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. SIPRI, my institute, and UNHCR have a partnership in order to explore many of the issues involved in conflict and displacement. And that's what we're going to be talking about today over the next up to an hour or so. The drivers, the root causes, the triggers, the trends, the problems in the international system which are acting as kind of blockages for addressing these issues, and the ways forward and grounds, we hope, for hope and optimism. So let's kick off. And first of all, Filippo Grandi in Geneva, welcome and thank you so much for agreeing to take part in this.
Thank you very much, Dan. Thank you for the invitation. It's a great pleasure and honor. And like you said, it's also it's a great opportunity to put in action already somehow the partnership that my organization, UNHCR and SIPRI, established. I think it was last year when I came to Stockholm, and then recently we signed an agreement, a partnership agreement. We're very proud of this type of partnership, of this one specifically, but of this type of partnership because, as you know, and we'll speak much more about this in this hour, the Global Compact on Refugees, which is very much the foundation of many of the initiatives that we are carrying out in these days, foresees partnership with academic institutions, think tanks, strategic think tanks, as very vital for our work. So I think that here what we are also doing, besides discussing interesting things of mutual concern, is also somehow showing the importance of having a working relationship between our different type of institutions.
And I think that part of what this is about is seeing what we each, as institutions, as organizations, bring to the moment where we meet. So let's kick off. Let me invite you to summarize the situation with forced displacement. I mean, every year, a little bit earlier than this in the year, UNHCR brings out its survey of the situation. What is that situation now, and in which direction is it developing? What are the trends?
I don't know if it is technology, Dan, or a coincidence, but you went into darkness as you were asking me this question. I couldn't see anymore the screen. Now I can see you again. So maybe, unfortunately, that's symbolic because your question relates to a trend, that of forced displacement, that has been going up for the past 5 or 6 years. The recent figures, as you said, we put out these figures every month in June on World Refugee Day on the 20th of June, indicated almost 80 million. So under this number, we count all people that are refugees or asylum seekers, but also people that are displaced internally for the same reasons that push refugees across borders. And this figure has been rising year after year, doubling in the past 10 years, if I'm not mistaken. And the pattern is that you have very old forced displacement situations like Somali refugees or Afghan refugees. Then you have what I would say hardcore mid duration issues like Syria in the 10 years or so, South Sudan and others, some of them chronic like South Sudan that have repeated themselves over and over again. And then you have a lot of new situations emerging. Think of the exponential rise of forced displacement in the Sahel in West Africa. This accounted for a large part of the increase of this year. And think of the spiraling number of Venezuelans fleeing their country. We categorized them separately for a variety of reasons, but we counted them under forced displacement, and there's more than 5 million. All the new crises add themselves to the old. None of the old crises for years now, except some very small ones, have been resolved. Hence this escalation year after.
And can I ask you, does that total of nearly 80 million, does that include the stateless people as well?
No, it does not include the stateless people who are not forcibly displaced, or not necessarily, although some of them, like the Rohingya, are also forcibly displaced, but they will be then counted in the figure of 80 million or 79.5 that I have mentioned. The stateless people, when my predecessor, Antonio Guterres, launched the 10 years campaign to reduce statelessness back in 2014, the figure that was used as an estimate of stateless people is about 10 million. I hesitate a bit to use those figures because it's very difficult to even estimate the real number of of stateless people. It's probably bigger than 10 million. And it's a very complex situation. But again, this is in addition to the figure that I have mentioned. And maybe, Dan, I think it may be interesting just to show also how our respective work interrelates or relates to each other. I've spoken about forced displacement, which is conflict related, and we can talk about the causes. I'd like to say a bit more later. But maybe you can give me your analysis from your angle of geopolitical issues and security to complete the picture in that respect.
Yeah, well, let's hope the screen doesn't go dark again as I start in on it. Start with the number of armed conflicts, and they are now somewhere over 50 armed conflicts going on in the world at the moment. The low 50s, let's say. It was 54 in 2019. Not sure what the figure will turn out to be this year. That compares to about 30 in 2010. It compares to just under 40 in the year 2000 and to 50 in the year 1990, around when the Cold War ended. So you can see a very clear trend. I mean, there are spikes and fluctuations up and down in between, but from the end of the Cold War to the beginning of this century, the zone of peace in the world expanded. In the first decade of this century, the zone of peace continued to expand. And since then, the situation has deteriorated badly. In terms of casualties, although this is another area where we have really not absolutely reliable data. We have some data, but I don't think it gives the full picture. But if you take data collected on the same basis, about twice as many people were killed in war in the second decade of the 21st century as in the first decade. So again, you have that deterioration. In terms of military spending, which is one of the other major things that indicators that my institute tracks, our figure for 2019 is 1.9 trillion US dollars on global military spending. And that is the highest that it has been in 30 years, the highest since the end of the Cold War. And the international trade in arms is also, as you would expect, given those figures, higher now than it was in we count in 5-year periods in order to smooth out fluctuations from one year to the next. So the current 5-year period is about 10% more by volume than the previous 5-year period. So all of these indicators have been moving in the wrong direction in recent years. And it was interesting, I noted that you said that over the past 5 or 6 years, you've had this steady increase in the number, or maybe not steady, but persistent increase in the number of people forcibly displaced. Also, over that period, we've had not steady, but persistent increase in the amount that's being spent on the military each year. So that is both, one could read that as being a contributory factor to insecurity, but it's also a reflection of insecurity. I mean, this is a very widespread perception of a very real problem, that the world is less safe, less secure now than it was 5 or 10 or 15 years ago. Yeah, that's why I was afraid the screen would go dark.
No, definitely. And of course, and you somehow alluded to it, it's not it's the number and frequency and intensity of conflicts, but it is also the manner in which conflicts are conducted, which increasingly in the past 10, maybe 20 years are targeting civilians, are affecting civilians much more than in the past. Not just affecting like the Second World War would have done through bombing and so forth, but also literally pushing people away from their homes in many ways. So this is all contributing to this large number. Maybe I should add, although this is quite complex, that of course the other big feature from our point of view is that these flows of people are increasingly complicated to even describe. Because in addition to conflict in all the variations that we know, and in addition to the traditional refugee-producing drivers like persecution or human rights violation, discrimination, etc., we have now other, maybe we had them before as well, but the overlap of the causes is staggering. You have inequality and poverty, you have climate change, and you have pandemics. So everything somehow overlaps, and the result is flows that are difficult to define, difficult to manage, difficult to respond to, and easy to manipulate politically. So this is, to me, almost worse than the numbers, because it makes the work of an organization like mine that still insists that refugees need to be dealt with within a certain legal framework, a framework of rights, and I think it is very important to insist on that, but it is much more difficult to do it than it was even 20 years ago.
And I think that part of the reason for the difficulty is not just the objective situation, but is the problem that we have in adjusting our ways of understanding to reflect that changed situation. So just there, when you describe that, you're actually describing something which I'm dealing with in a chapter I'm trying to write now for a book on security. And the question which this chapter is about is, well, what are the security issues of the day? On the one hand, of course, we still have the worry about nuclear war. We have nuclear arms control breaking down. We have armed conflicts going on. We have the increase in the general feeling of insecurity that we've talked about. We have the pressures from climate change. We have the pressures from growing inequality. Climate change itself is but one product of the weird way in which humanity has behaved towards nature, which is also producing the zoonotic diseases, which are the pandemics, the diseases that move from animals to people, like COVID-19, like Ebola, and so on. And so we have to have a way of understanding security which has this greater breadth, at the same time as we need institutions which are focused on dealing with specific issues within. But I do think that we need some kind of shift in our thinking to understand that the world is changing, and changing at quite a considerable pace. I mean, it's not so long ago that it seemed like a legitimate thing to bemoan climate change because of the world we would leave to our children. But actually, the problem of climate change is now is real. It's having an impact on people who are amongst the 80 million whom you've counted in your statistics.
Yeah, and if you take many situations, this overlap of causes is really extremely evident and at the same time very complex. And like you said, it defies the categorization that we've been used to for decades, but it cannot weaken the legal provisions that are in place for at least some of the people impacted. But certainly it generates the need to establish parameters for others that, for example, in Libya, this is a very typical example, people coming from all sorts of situations, conflicts, traditional refugee producing context, but also simply people that are seeking better economic opportunities. No doubt that you have a big mix and maybe even a preponderance of the economic side. But, all these people then, because opportunities for mobility are so huge, but also so risky, because you have a flourishing trafficking industry. So everybody, different categories, are channeled into extremely dangerous routes. You see this in North Africa, you see this in the Bay of Bengal, you see this in Central America big time. The channel to that, so they're all exposed to the risk. And in some places like Libya, the risks are exponential, are multiplied by other conflicts. So somehow all of them become people in need of protection. But it defies the traditional categories to then define this population and put states in front of their obligation. You see what I mean? It's a difficult one to explain, but this is the big challenge that we have in places like Central America or Libya. And this is where we need to form different coalitions, and we need to really step up our ability to describe also for the general public the extreme challenges of these situations.
I think that you and your colleagues and in other agencies like you're put on the front line and given the instruction to apply some Band-Aid, right? to respond to the symptoms of the problem. And as you said, it's extremely important that the legal mandate to keep on doing that continues. And I would draw a parallel and say, yes, also the law, the nature of warfare may be changing, but it is crucial that what we used to call the laws of war, or now international humanitarian law, that legal framework persists. But behind that, if we're going to do more than deal with the results of the problem, if we're going to be addressing the root causes of the problem, that's where we have to have this analytical approach, which can start going in and seeing how the different issues connect up to each other. I think that one of the difficulties here in terms of thinking one's way through this is that if you start from climate, you could see climate change as explaining, an awful lot of the difficulties that we face. If you start from the point of looking at economics and inequality, you can see that as produced. If you start from the point of view of something else, you can see that as well. Or you can just focus on people's propensity to violence, and you can see this as being the issue. And all of these starting points are real, and none of them is the whole explanation. And that's the difficulty, is bringing together an explanation which is fairly quick to communicate, fairly straightforward to understand, and actually complex enough to be accurate.
This is a very fascinating, although very difficult subject, because somehow, you can take 2 or 3 elements of what you have described in relation to population movements, because you have the whole world of root causes. And as you said, you can describe the phenomenon linking it to any of them, but in reality, it's the combination which drives so many people, because the 80 million people is the one that we painfully categorize as people in need of international protection, displaced or refugee protection. But then there's many others that do not fall under the category that are also moving. So this complex movement requires addressing the root causes. Because of the complementarity of these causes, I think that the only way is international cooperation. It's very difficult. It's very difficult because we also, we open up here another chapter, but we also live in a world in which this international cooperation is actually talked against by leaders. It's actually undermined by the rhetoric of domestic politics in so many important countries. So it's very difficult when you need it most that you have the least embracing of this approach. On the other hand, you have to, as you said, it's a matter of mandates. It's our mandate on refugee protection, is the mandate of the ICRC on international humanitarian law, just to mention the 2 most obvious ones, but there's others. So the legal obligation, we need to continuously insist that they be upheld, even in this, because they're still extremely relevant for millions of those on the move. And then I would say that somehow, just like at the root cause, you need to work together and impact everybody to whatever you do. The same is true at the other end. Take a situation which is very much known in Europe, rescuing people at sea. There you make no distinction anymore. There you have an overarching humanitarian imperative. So you go from the overarching humanitarian imperative to more specialized intervention, back to the root causes where, again, you have to work together. You see what I mean? It's a complex articulation that I think we haven't given sufficient thought to. And work of institutions like yours will be very valuable to help us, all of us, navigate literally through these very complicated scenarios.
Yes, I think there's an issue of, you could call it human mobility. I mean, this you were talking about earlier, the different reasons why people move. And those who move from different places and with different motives and motivations for their move, different things driving them or pulling them, their experience intersects along the routes that they take in their mobility. And as you said, sometimes one just has to think about the human need which is there. And sometimes one needs to think much more coolly, in a way, and analytically about, well, what are the roots of the problem? If we look at the cooperation issue, there's a paradox, isn't there? Because on the one hand, well, there's two paradoxes, I think. So let me set them out. Right? One thing, I think, is that I see maybe 6 big kind of meta issues on which we cannot get solutions without cooperation. And forced displacement is one part of 2 of those issues, because I think those issues are to do with nuclear weapons, arms control, security more generally. They're to do with climate change. They're to do with cyber crisis, cyber crash, to do with pandemics, and then 2 which are sort of outside of human control, the nightmare scenarios of the supervolcano or the meteorite. And all of these things demand, either today or if it were ever to happen with the supervolcano and the meteorite hitting the planet, they would demand unprecedented degrees of cooperation. And we are in a world where we need more cooperation, more broadly and more deeply than we have had before. And yet, paradoxically, as you've said, we have this declining appetite for cooperation. But then the second paradox is that at the same time as you see the declining appetite amongst leaders, you see very, very strong institutions of cooperation, which are even surviving and even growing, stepping up to meet the increased challenges, even in that difficult political climate. I mean, UNHCR is one, International Committee of the Red Cross another, World Food Programme, some of the international NGOs. In general, the architecture of cooperation within the United Nations amongst the agencies seems to me to be really quite thriving, even while the politics surrounding it is very, very difficult.
Yeah, and sometimes you wonder whether this adversity for international cooperation by states or some governments, I would say, doesn't backfire big time on them, because cooperation is needed. This is why, institutions like the Red Cross or the UN humanitarian organization, that's why we're somehow kept alive, not kept alive, but supported, funded, allowed to work, although with many different obstacles and difficulties. I think one point that I always make to my colleagues is that we have to navigate a very complex path, or walk a very complex path always. One is the path of being custodians of principles. And I think it's, that's what we are asked to do by the international community. The other is to be, especially as a UN organization, to be supportive of states to carry out those obligations in the most effective manner, and a manner that makes it possible for them to do it, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
We must be also very pragmatic. We must be principled but useful as well. And by being useful, and we always try to be useful, a lot of our work is to work with governments to say, okay, these are the principles of asylum. And this, by the way, are all the tools that we can use to make asylum work in a manner that does not constitute a burden for you, but can even be, a contribution. And that usefulness is key at a time when states criticize us publicly or push us back publicly because it is domestically convenient to gain votes, but at the same time reach back to us when they need, because we have the technical expertise and we can ensure effectiveness in what they do. This is very important. And I think that being useful to states should not be seen as an abdication to our principles, but rather as a manner to make those principles possible, effective, applied. So this is where the United Nations can be useful to international cooperation, even at a time when that is a bad word for some leaders and for some states. And I think that we should not give up on that. We should persist, because there is space for us to operate. Look at the debate on asylum in Europe, a pretty desperate debate, if you ask me, at the moment, going backwards rather than forward. But I keep telling my colleagues, we don't give up, because I think that we still have lots of tools for states to apply this, and actually to be more effective than building those walls or pushing people back, which causes suffering, causes death, and doesn't solve the problem fundamentally.
I mean, not only it doesn't solve the problem, but in many ways it exacerbates it, of course. It makes it worse. And I think, I look at Europe now and I see a kind of politics where too widely, and, starting in my own country, the UK as well, this sense that blame the foreigner. That's the most useful thing to do. It's somebody else's fault. It's outside the national border. It's somewhere else. And it is so, if you were to be following that logic, you would start to strip away and weaken some of the most important international instruments, well, not just the most important international instruments, the most important instruments that are available for any government, especially on the scale of European governments, to be able to handle the problems that we're facing. So it does seem to me as if there is something somewhere in there where we need to find, alongside of the principles, alongside of the utility, this idea of some way of describing and communicating the problems and the best approach to them in a way which respects the complexity and yet is kind of straightforward enough for people to be grasping. Thinking as a country or as a city or as a community, you can solve some of these problems by yourself is just fantasy land. The only realistic thing is to work together with others.
No, absolutely. And I think that communicating this respect for the complexity, but also a sense that by working together, that complexity can be addressed, is something that we, very operational organization, confronted every day with crisis, we can do. But this is where we need the help of institutions like yours, through evidence-based arguments, linking it to the very important and compelling argument of collective security that is always so important for states. This is where perhaps, these are the type of arguments that they understand also very well. And if you can help us make linkages, you will help us overcome some of the obstacles. I would also say, what you said is very interesting. The one of the main arguments that states or governments are making these days in respect of forced displacement is, we're full, we cannot take anybody anymore, let others do it. Or even, in Europe, there's been a strong streak of talk about let's externalize all this. Let people ask for asylum in Europe from embassies and consulates outside Europe. So hereby destroying the very principle of asylum, which is physical access to safe territory where you then seek asylum. And I think that this argument that, let's not have them here, let's have them somewhere else, is a paradox, is a self-defeating argument, because then others will say the same. And let's not forget, going back to the basics here, the 80 million people, 80% of those people are in poor countries or in middle income countries at best, which struggle sometimes even more than poor countries because they have less ways to resort to international aid. And therefore, for rich countries to argue the door is closed, we've taken our fill, and now you go back, or this is not just against all principles, it defies logic. And it does not help those countries at all. As a matter of fact, when I go to those countries, and there too, of course, I have to always argue, please keep borders open, allow people in distress to seek asylum. They start now telling me, and they've been saying this for a few years, why should we do that? Since rich countries are sending people back to us and re-burdening us even more than we're already burdened. So this pushing from one to the other is not only profoundly inhumane because it causes untold suffering for people who fundamentally don't find a safe haven and may have to be pushed back to their own country where there is conflict or persecution or whatever, but it also doesn't solve the problem. Whilst cooperation is much more conducive, and sometimes at a relatively small cost, because when you divide up this big problem by the many countries in the world, frankly, you realize very quickly that those are not too complicated situations that to solve, at least in terms of receiving people.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. I mean, this whole thing of displacing the problem, that's all you do, is you displace it. It may grow worse in its new location, but you certainly haven't solved it. But could you, maybe we take a couple of minutes, you could tell us something about the Global Refugee Compact and what that brings to you in terms of, in this context of cooperating to resolve these kinds of problems rather than just displacing them?
Well, that, in a way, the compact, or rather the compacts, because as you know, there's two. There's a refugee compact, which we largely drove together with states, and then they established in the General Assembly in, 2018. And then there is a compact for safe and orderly migration, which it's more our colleagues in the International Organization for Migration, IOM, that have driven that together with states. It was a slightly different process, but also that compact was established at the same time in December 2018. And in a way, these compacts are our proposal for international cooperation in these difficult times. The Refugee Compact, which is of course closer to my work, is not a proposition of new principles. It's simply a set of tools that we are proposing to states, but also to civil society, to the private sector, to other players, to international organizations, to work together more effectively to address the problem of the 80 million people. It's as simple as that. It's quite complex in its articulation. It builds on a lot of existing experiences. It's more than just a catalog of tools. It's also a proposal on how to work together. But I have to say that, of course, it's in 2018 when we drove it through the General Assembly till its positive conclusion. It was not an easy discussion, but frankly, for me, it was fascinating to see how states wanted it fundamentally, because they understood that there was a strong need for that. And this was not just what we would call the main host countries, usually poorer countries that, of course, are really anxious to have a bigger responsibility sharing mechanism because they have the biggest burden, let's face it, of the 80 million. But also donor countries that wanted, for example, to expand the donor base, wanted to involve civil society and the private sector more systematically. So this combination of different players going beyond states, I think, was also a very good intuition of the Refugee Compact. 1,400 pledges were made by states and other actors 1 year after. This was December 2019. We organized a big refugee forum in Geneva, the first time we did that. Then, of course, the implementation of these pledges has been challenged a little bit by the pandemic, but we're on track on realizing many of them. And I think that once things hopefully settle down, this will be a very good roadmap on how to achieve cooperation even in these adverse circumstances.
And the thing just to add into that from my side is that I came to the Global Refugee Forum in Geneva last December. And I thought what was so interesting was the energy there that was generated by the encounters between different kinds of people, different kinds of actors coming from different backgrounds, different geographies, different sorts of organizations, different mandates and responsibilities, focusing onto the issue of problems and trends as far as forced displacement is concerned. Maybe we can. Sorry.
Just one quick point here. In a world in which international cooperation of the traditional sort between states is very much challenged, I wouldn't say it's in crisis. Let's say it's challenged. This model of this hybrid model where you have civil society, NGOs. Of course, NGOs have been our traditional partner for decades, but the Global Compact gives them a proper recognition of their important role in this situation. And same for the private sector, which is just entering more timidly into this discussion, but has been phenomenal in proposing, for example, new business models on how to deal even with refugee camps that I find fascinating. It's been a great learning experience. Now, all of this is a good model. Maybe we need to go beyond this slightly old, little bit paralyzed interstate cooperation mechanism, bring in new and dynamic actors without bypassing states. States have responsibilities and want to be in the lead, that's clear, but all these actors can enrich the debate and open up new possibilities. I don't want to sound too optimistic. It's a road uphill, but still it is a road.
But then, thinking of road, let's look ahead for a bit. I mean, I think it's very easy, if we think about trends, to wind ourselves back into that dark screen again. Things have been getting worse, and if you draw a trend line, then it's going to be just so much worse. Gloom, and it becomes disabling. And at the same time, a kind of a shallow optimism is not that much more enabling and empowering. But how do you see trends now playing out? I mean, on the one hand, the increase in the number of forcibly displaced people for a variety of reasons has been going up. We've also got background issues, climate change, the impact is heavier and heavier, sharper and sharper. We've also seen with world hunger that we're after 2.5 decades of the statistics looking better and better, world hunger is on the increase again. There are more hungry people worldwide now than there were 4 or 5 years ago. And we've talked about the context not being so good. So we can see the negative trends quite clearly. But we also, as we've talked about, there are countervailing forces. Nothing comes out easy in that. But how would you see those things moving forward?
Well, I think you are right. There's countervailing forces and perhaps even more importantly, countervailing models that are being proposed. I mean, I spoke about the compact because this is very much, as you have seen, close to our heart. And also, this is the model that we propose for forced displacement. But of course, in a broader way, you have the SDGs, right? You have the Sustainable Development Goals, which are very comprehensive and which are a blueprint for sustainable development, but through that addressing human rights, addressing conflict, addressing climate, addressing inequality. So, that's an excellent model if it is embraced, supported, financed, legislated in every country. I mean, this is going to be big, very challenging work, but we do have a model. But frankly, going back away from the optimism, which I hope is not too shallow, but it always sounds a bit idealistic, to the reality, it is very clear that the international community has to be clearly engaged in some of the issues. I would say, the security piece is key, the conflict resolution is key, reform of the Security Council, make those institutions work again. I mean, it is not possible. I've been in this job of High Commissioner for almost 5 years. I have hardly ever seen the Security Council unanimous on anything, even on the most elementary humanitarian issues. It's very rare. It's once, in a blue moon that you have a resolution where they all come together and say, let's do that. And I'm even not talking about what they should be focusing on, peace and security. But like I said, even on access for humanitarian agencies, even on that, in places like Yemen and in places like Libya, or Syria, they can't get together. So if that is not addressed, frankly, I think that all the blueprints that the UN is offering to the international community, the fora that the UN, the space that the UN can afford, because that is its role, will not be effective. And the other one is probably climate. Is climate because, the Paris Accord, and we've seen a lot of backtracking there and going away from the commitments, and that is extremely dangerous, as you know. And behind that is, of course, the whole issue of sustainable development. But the climate engagement are very important. So I think that if, at least on these issues, climate and security and peace and security, if there's no turnaround from the present negative trend, then I'm afraid even my strong optimism, born into years and years of this work, is going to be shaken, I think, and we need to be very worried. And what is the advice that one can give? I speak often publicly on these matters, and then especially students and others say, what do you advise? You know what I say? Vote well. Vote for people those of you who can vote for people in your country that talk about these issues in this manner, and not purely from a vote-getting domestic perspective. I think that we have, at least there, all of us, a fundamental duty to pay attention to politicians in our country that say the right things, that promote international cooperation. Because otherwise, frankly, if we speak about that in theory and we don't act politically in our own little sphere to try and promote that, we will not have done our duty.
Yeah, I could not agree with you more. I mean, I think that is absolutely fundamental, and I think that one of the, the grounds for hope. People of my age often remark on how short-term is the thinking of the younger folk now, and from that point of view, the wake-up call that people of my age got from the Fridays for the Future movement, which is here are people, teenagers, thinking ahead and really pushing the generation which is in power to think about the fact that, decisions which are, it's mostly actually, Filippo, it's decisions which are not being taken now will come back to haunt us in decades to come. The longer we wait on issues like climate change, but also on resolving the underlying drivers of conflict, so therefore the more people who are displaced, the bigger these problems become, the harder it is to handle them, the harder it is to return to something that we would like to see. Not normality, but something that's better than that, with people having the conditions for a dignified life, for prosperity, for a degree of happiness and contentment. There is a lot of pressure now in the security sphere, and I think it's something I wouldn't care to forecast as to which way it's going to turn out, because on the one hand, I think one can see the possibility that the number of violent conflicts could be increasing. I'm afraid there is that risk. You can see a number of places where there are old unresolved issues, and you cannot see really enough institutions to be able to manage disputes peacefully, to keep those, to maintain the ordinary peace and security. I think there are also some signs that this could be getting towards reaching its peak, and that there will be a turn down again. Military spending, in parentheses, probably won't increase very much over the next few years as a result of the economic consequences of the pandemic. It's quite possible, separately from that, that conflict resolution will get a new injection of energy and even some success rates in some parts of especially Africa, where issues have been rising up again. I'm less hopeful, I'm afraid, at the moment about the Middle East. But certainly at Sub-Saharan Africa, I think there's the prospects are not all negative there. So I think one can see things, some glimmers of hope, some signs of hope here and there. But I think the key to it is the thing that we've kept on stressing time and again through the conversation so far, is the importance of international cooperation and the international institutions. We have various roadmaps laid out for us, the Global Compact on Refugees, the Sustainable Development Goals, as you said, and we do have an institutional architecture which is there. It needs some adjustment, it needs some strengthening, it needs some change. We need to be developing our thinking more, but I think there are all the possibilities there if we can only kind of focus our efforts and our energy onto that. Is there a possibility, Filippo, that you can now, if we try to come in the last 10 minutes or so of chatting, come to some things which are more specific, more concrete, that you think could be done and should be taken up? I'm not thinking necessarily by SIPRI in this partnership, but something which is more than just saying or more specific than saying we need to cooperate more. As important as that message is, what would be the practical, the almost operational expression of it?
Sorry, before I answer your question, just to add one point to the forecast, because I didn't really maybe answer thoroughly to that one. Just to add that I think it's very interesting what you're saying about maybe some peak in military spending, but although you preface that by saying that it's very difficult to forecast, and I would agree with that. On the other hand, I think that in translating this into issues that my organization deals with, I think we need to resign ourselves to the fact that the complexity of this phenomena that we're dealing with will continue and needs to be recognized. One of the things that I think is most worrying is another effect of short-term politics is to try and simplify all this, to explain them in very simple terms, because it's easier for politicians to do it. Unfortunately, these are not simple problems. These are very complex, and that complexity is whatever the trend of conflict is likely to increase, with more possibilities for human mobility, that they will increase. Now we have a lull because of the pandemic, but that will resume surely. And with the fact that these long routes, which didn't exist in the past, in the past, forced displacement was very short term, was very, from one country to the next. Now it extends along these very long routes, which themselves cross other areas of conflict or climate change or poverty. So this is extremely complex. It makes it much more complicated for all of us. And I think we need to recognize that and work together, also because it's not one actor, but many that have to together to address the various aspects of the phenomenon. And in terms of what you said, I don't know. I think that there's many things that one could say to be more specific, but I would say, since I'm also speaking here at SIPRI, that perhaps looking at renewing efforts on 3 or 4 big conflict situations in Africa, for example, and revisit how they are being dealt with and see whether they are actually conducive to a conclusion. Look at South Sudan. What we are trying to do from our modest refugee perspective is to engage Sudan, South Sudan, regional organizations like IGAD, and the African Union, of course, and other states in the region to look at displacement in and from these two neighboring countries, which both are undergoing a peace process internally, and see whether we couldn't piggyback on those peace processes to try and address and resolve the plight of millions, literally, that are displaced in the Horn of Africa. So perhaps, marry these efforts that we're doing from the humanitarian side with an analysis of these conflicts and see whether they are actually conducive to those solutions. I don't know if I'm clear about that, but I think that sometimes there's almost a giving up on these peace processes and or an attention that spans a few months or years and then recedes. Look at northern Nigeria, another big pool of displacement across the entire West Africa, now linking up with insecurity in the Sahel in what is potentially one of the largest situations of humanitarian crisis and forced displacement in the world. Why not, with institutions like yours, but also beyond that, focus on this? What can we do? Have we tried everything possible? Are there new creative avenues? And we need to insist on the peace processes, on the peace and security tracks, because it starts from there if you want to bring solution. I don't know. And, I don't think we should focus on 50 of these, but 3, 4, 5 of the key ones would help reduce that figure that you asked me to start this conversation with.
And I think one of the things in that is that my answer to my own challenge, to be more specific, is that if we followed your line of thought there, we need to be willing to ask some uncomfortable questions. We need to be willing to ask questions which get uncomfortable answers, because an awful lot of external involvement in these situations that you're talking about has got to a certain point of preventing the situation from deteriorating to be much, much worse. It stopped a catastrophe from turning into a disaster, right? But it still remains as a catastrophic situation for the people who have to live in it. And it seems as if the form of external support which is given, which is not, of course, just humanitarian and development aid, it is also the security support, and it is the political and the diplomatic and the broader economic support which is given, doesn't lend itself to actually achieving something that you could call a solution. It lends itself to achieving a managed problem. But that problem still has enormous human consequences. So I think it would be that willingness to be asking some difficult questions. And then I think that the other thing would be that I would say is that looking further ahead, as you look, for example, at climate change and the issue of sea level rise, not just thinking about the small island developing states which face an existential crisis, but also thinking about low-lying coastal plains. I mean, there's about 800 million to 1 billion people who live on coastal plains within 5 meters of sea level. And if it is right, as the IPCC projects, that what used to be once in a lifetime surges in sea level will start to become annual events, then a lot of low-lying major cities are going to be at serious risk. Then indeed we may have issues of disputes, conflicts, displacement and forced displacement of people on a scale perhaps looking further ahead, the late 2020s, 2030s, into 2.5 decades from now, but on a scale that would make today's problems seem unfortunately relatively modest. And I think that we have some time actually to be thinking our way through those problems and putting measures in place to not just to adapt to them, but to mitigate them and to prevent them from getting to be really truly serious. And using the time that we have, I think that's the other really crucially important thing.
Somehow what you're saying is that how can I explain this? That we need to, we have an additional duty here to try and convey the message that there are bigger risks to be run if short-term interests are not abandoned in favor of this longer-term strategy, if you see what I mean. I find it absolutely both fascinating and somehow disquieting that an organization like mine, which frankly is mandated with the shortest possible term type of issues, we need to save lives at risk. We need to ensure protection of people that have lost the protection of their states. And then, of course, we have to also find solutions. But our fundamental work is very short term. And here we are now having to remind our interlocutors, states in particular, public opinions as well, that unless they change parameters, unless they move away from the short-termism that they are applying and they don't look ahead, even medium term, not to mention long term, then we will be busy 10 times more doing rescue and doing protection and helping them face the bigger risk. But somehow creating that awareness that risk can escalate if we don't take some risks now. Because, of course, let's face it, states don't like to cooperate always. State interests always prevail. So there is always a difficult political effort that needs to be made to convince public opinions that it's good to work with others, give up a bit, compromise in order to reach better objectives. So it's paradoxical that it's us, the humanitarians, and so often I see this in so many of these crises, that have to remind the international community of the long term. But so be it. If this is one of the things that we need to do, we'll continue to do it. And we need the help of people like you to make these arguments much more clear than I'm making them, and evidence-based through research and otherwise.
But I think that the reason why that responsibility, faute de mieux, falls on you is because you're on the front line. You and other similar agencies see the consequences of inattention to the underlying problems close up. And that gives you a real urgency about wanting to the underlying problems and the root causes to be addressed. So it is strange, but I mean, those who have given you that mandate have now turned their attention possibly to other things, and it's hardly, so the responsibility is yours. And I feel really honored, Filippo, when you say that you want to work with us on this, because I think UNHCR, as I say, is a tremendous agency right in the front line, and we're very, very honored to be working along with you on some of these issues at least. We're getting towards the last couple of minutes, so I guess this is the time when you have to find a way to encapsulate all of the wisdom that you've just been expressing over the last 58 or so minutes in a 1-minute takeaway, and then I'll try and do the same in my own way afterwards. But what would you want the audience who've been watching us, and because this will go up online and stay there, the audience that will watch us, what would you like them to be taking away? A couple of key thoughts.
I would say that the key word here is engage, isn't it? Now, I assume that most of the people listening to us are already engaged. So somehow it's an open door, I think, for many. But a lot of society is not engaged. It's a bit what I said earlier about voting, and not to be now accused of propaganda, because that's not my job to take side for any party in any country, but to expand that concept. What I really meant is that it is important to engage. If I tweet on something, I can be assured, especially if it is something a bit controversial, that I will have dozens of negative comments. Very few constructive ones, very few comments on my modest social media, but I suppose it's true for others as well. That type of engagement needs a bit of courage, needs the courage of facing people that have very harsh and violent arguments against international cooperation, against humanitarianism, against human rights, but we need to engage. I think that we need to engage more and better, more smartly and more strategically. And be it through voting, but also in many, many other ways in which one can engage in society. The Global Compact shows the many ways in which each one of us can engage in this particular aspect of dealing with forced displacement. But the same is true for climate, the same is true for poverty reduction, the same is true for global health issues, just to mention three topical matters. Engage is very important, and let's try to engage people that are sitting on the fence, that are in the middle, because if we pull them on the side of positive, constructive, evidence-based engagement, then we have a better chance for the international community to actually engage positively in addressing the long-term risks that we have described today.
Filippo, thank you so much, not just for the last encapsulation of the message, which I thought is great and I think will resonate, but also for the whole hour, for the whole conversation. And I want to say thank you to the online audience, both today and the one that will be watching in the future as this stays online. My own quick takeaways from this are what they often are usually, actually. One is the importance of knowing, of understanding, of being able to analyze the problems in order to act on them properly. And the second one is the crucial importance of cooperating. Whether we think of it in terms of my institute cooperating with UNHCR, whether we think of it in terms of interstate cooperation, working together is the fundamental. Thank you very, very much for joining us.